When the Friedrich Institute asked me to talk about the challenges of big tech, I thought to myself, no sweat. They invited me 3 years ago to talk about the same topic. I'll cut and paste the same presentation, no problem at all. I opened up the presentation, I saw it's completely irrelevant anymore. Things changed, things evolved, and also I'm much more involved today with the global perspectives of big tech after researching the topics and being involved with them. And I want to talk much more today about the global perspective of big tech. So I had to start all over again. I have to tell you, I will ask you to forget everything that I told you yesterday about deregulation, because unlike my general message of yesterday that deregulation promotes competition, I think there is one sector that is really different. There's a sector that grew in the last few decades with almost no regulation whatsoever. It grew to enormous sizes, and we'll discuss it in a minute. And I think it is now time to think very thoroughly on how to regulate these sectors, regulate them smartly and with purpose. But it is time to try to think about how to really regulate these industries and these sectors, and that's very different than what I think about the traditional economy. So let me start by saying that when we talk about big tech, we usually mention the 5 big companies: Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, today Meta, and Microsoft. They are usually the first names that come up to mind, and in fact, they are drawing a lot of our attention when we talk about problems in big tech. But there are many, many other big and dominant platforms. I'll mention only a few, whether it's Uber, or whether it's Airbnb, or whether it's eBay, or many other platforms that we know today that work pretty much on the same business model or on the same technological model of the big tech. So when I talk about big tech, I will mention quite a lot the 5 big, which I usually call today MAAM, M-A-A-A-M, because it's Meta, Amazon, Alpha, Apple, and Microsoft. So that's the current acronym for them. But there are others, and I'll try to talk about rules that will be applicable to the big 5 and also to many other companies that work on the same model. So first of all, I'll start with the sizes of these companies. So the sizes are almost inconceivable to mankind. I put a few slides. There are not, we can demonstrate it in many other ways, but I put a few slides to try and demonstrate the sizes. So that's the shares of Google since they went public in 2004 and until 2015. They went up 5 times. And in January 2021, their value crossed the threshold of $1 trillion, okay? $1 trillion. When you look at Microsoft has been in the market for much longer than Google, and they crossed, their value today is approximately $2 trillion. When you look at Apple went public in the 80s. Today its value is approximately $2.5 billion. The revenues of Apple each year are somewhat around the area of the budget of the State of Israel. So what Apple makes each year in revenues equals approximately the budget of the State of Israel. The budget of the US is around $6.5 trillion. Only Apple value is $2.5 trillion. So the sizes of these companies are sizes that are really, it's very difficult to grasp and to understand them. In addition, what happens in these companies is that they start in one sector, in one market, and they go on and expand their activity to more and more markets. And in many markets that they enter to, they become quite dominant and have quite a huge presence in this market. So just for example, I'll take Google. Google started, as a search engine not long ago, but it was a very good search engine. Today we see them everywhere, and I wrote here only a few sectors in which they are active. So they have their social network through YouTube that belongs to Google. They have financial services through Google Pay. They have, of course, the Gmail that we all use as a corresponding facility. They are an advertising empire. It's one of the biggest advertising platforms in the world. They hold Android, and we'll talk about the strengths that they have through through Android. They produce cell phones through Pixel, and they are navigation platform through Google Maps and Waze that they acquired. So and that only mentions some of the activities of Google. I'm sure that if I would have put some more attention on the slide, I would be able to mention many more areas in which they are active, health, and other areas in which they are expanding to. So that's only Google, and we see the same goes for many other companies, or big tech companies, meaning. So I think that one of the most important things to understand is that when we talk about the issues of big tech and the challenges that they bring to us, we have to understand that these are not only competition issues. We have all kinds of challenges coming from big tech. So I'll mention only a few sectors. So we have antitrust and competition, but we have also issues of freedom of speech. We have also issues of privacy. We have also cyber concerns. We have also consumer protection rules. We have B2B issues, how the big platforms treat the small businesses that rely on them in order to promote themselves or in order to get to their consumers. So the relation between the platforms and the businesses that they serve are also a huge issue that we didn't really cover yet. So it raises quite a lot of issues. But for some reason, or maybe for a justified reason, the antitrust agencies and the competition agencies were at the forefront of the pressure to act towards big tech. So a lot of the public pressure on handling big tech, regulating big tech, trying to address the issues was tunneled to the competition agencies and the antitrust agencies around the world. But when we discuss it, and I'll get back to it at the end of my presentation, I think we need to understand that it's not only competition issues. And in many cases, competition agencies find themselves under pressure to give answers and solutions to things that they just don't know how to deal with and how to answer. So we'll talk about this too, going on forward. So I want to talk a little bit on why big tech is such a challenge for regulators. And what's the problem with big tech? Why can't we do just the same as we do with traditional market? And I'll stay a while on this slide because there's a lot to talk about. Why is it such a challenge? So there are several reasons. I mentioned the most prominent ones here in this slide. I'll start with a very basic one. Truly, we don't understand them. We don't understand what they do. In the competition agencies, we're a bunch of lawyers and economists. Really, we don't understand the technology. So this is a problem. It's not a very big problem because competition agencies are trained to learn industries that they analyze and industries that they investigate. So they need to put the resources, but they will be able, and they are in some cases able, to understand the technology. And in fact, we see that quite a lot of agencies are building technological units within them to be able to have the sufficient knowledge to deal with the technological industries. But this is a challenge. I think it's an achievable challenge. I think that the competition agencies will be able to deal with it. But that's the first challenge, and don't underestimate it. It's a hill that the competition agencies should climb and should cross. The second challenge is that we're talking about new goods, new services, and really, when you come to think about it, big tech brought a lot of prosperity and a lot of new things to our reality. They brought products that we couldn't even imagine exist. They invented markets that we couldn't even imagine before. We enjoy today things that when I was a child I couldn't imagine would ever be possible. They were way beyond my imagination. We correspond with each other very easily across the world. We shop and get our shopping to our house in a very short period. We order our stuff, whether it's hotel or taxi driver or whatever service we want, through the application. It really we pay through them. They brought a lot of good to our life. I think they brought a lot of good to humanity, and I think they really promoted civilization. So when we start accusing big tech, we also need to remember, and I think the competition agencies remember it very well, that these big tech with the technology and invention brought to all of us a lot of good, and in many cases for free. We'll talk about it as another challenge, the issue of free, and we love them. We cannot imagine today our lives without having all the information that we need in our hand, in our cell phone. When I was a child, we couldn't do a discussion and have all the data in our hand. And I threw away all the encyclopedias that my parents saved penny to penny to buy me, so I'll be able to read them to go to school. They were all thrown to the garbage. No need for them anymore. So really, our life improved a lot by big tech, and we shouldn't forget that. So when we try to regulate big tech, we need to keep that in mind and make sure that we do not do any damage to this part of the advantages of big tech to humanity and to civilization. The other thing is that for competition agencies, when things come to their doorstep, it's very difficult for them to anticipate the direction of the technology. In many cases, the technological people understand where they're heading much better than the competition agencies. And even they cannot really anticipate everything. So for example, 10 years ago, I was engaged as a lawyer with the 3D printing industry. The anticipation was that in 2-3 years, there won't be factories necessary anymore. Everything will switch to 3D printing. Well, it turned out to be much more difficult than that. I think that the same goes for autonomous vehicles. I was told that by 2022 we will all be riding autonomous vehicles. Well, apparently it will take much more time. Maybe we'll reach there, but it will take much more time. So even the technological people, they have some problems dealing with where the technology is heading, what will be successful, and what will become obsolete in a few years. They are not always able to anticipate that. Yet, let alone the competition agencies that are not in the industry and need to anticipate it from the outside. So, for example, when there's a merger, when Facebook wants to acquire Instagram and wants to acquire WhatsApp, Mark Zuckerberg understands very well why he wants to buy Instagram and WhatsApp, because he, in his vision, see Instagram as a competitor rising that challenges his social network. And he see WhatsApp as a network that is rising up and will challenge his own network. But when these mergers were filed to the antitrust agencies, no chance that they were able to understand that WhatsApp or Instagram at that stage and at this position are a competition challenge to Facebook. They were not there. They couldn't anticipate it. So what we know today in hindsight, is not what we knew when agencies looked at this merger. So this is a huge challenge. We do not know where the technology is heading. Another challenge is the issue of incentive to innovation. You will hear that a lot from the big tech when they are concerned about regulation that is coming towards them. They will always discuss incentive to innovation. And in fact, there is a point here, because there's a lot of investment going into innovation, and we hear the cases of success. But successes are few and failures are many. And we know that in Israel, as a startup nation, we know that many startups close at the end of the day. They just don't succeed. The product is not good enough, or is not marketable, or is not attractive enough, whatever. They are just not able to hit and make a success. So the failures are many, the successes are few, and we want to motivate innovation. So if we want to motivate innovation, we need to prize the few technologies that succeed at the end of the day. And if once you're successful, you're punished for your success, or you're cut for your success, then this really affect the incentive to innovation. So, for example, if we will say that we do not allow big tech to acquire new startups, which is in fact a regulatory suggestions being discussed currently. If we will say that, then startups, how will they achieve financing? How will they convince the venture capitals to invest in them if there is no possibility for selling your technology to one of the big techs? They will be much less attractive in raising money They will be much less attractive for investors. And all the ecosystem that was built around big tech may collapse if we interfere too much with incentive to innovation and incentive to the incentive to innovation. So this is also something that that needs to be considered when interfering with big tech. The other problem is network effect. I'll explain a little bit what is a network effect. Network effect is a situation where the more people consume the same product, they achieve more from their consumption. So when consumption of one product by a larger number of users give rise to increase in the benefit of the use, then you can see a network effect. So the very basic example will be a phone. When the telephone was invented and the first customer acquired telephone, he didn't really have any use in it because he couldn't phone anyone because no one had phone. But then one additional person bought a phone, and then they could talk with each other on the phone. But once everyone has a telephone, then we can pick up the phone and call everyone with a telephone. So the more people acquire telephones, the more beneficial my telephone is for me at my house. So now when you look at this principle and you think about big tech, you find that this is the model for many, many digital platforms. So when we have social media, like Facebook, the essence of social media is that we're all using the same platform. And because we're all using the same platform, that's why it's beneficial for us, because all our friends are there. And then we can learn about what's going on in their life. And that's how it becomes beneficial for us. If only I would have used Facebook, it would have no benefit for me whatsoever. And the same goes for the search engine of Google. The more data they have from us on our searches, the more they're able to make a better search engine. The same goes for Airbnb. The more hotels or rooms that put themselves on the platform, it becomes more attractive for clients to come in and register for the hotels in the room. And the more clients coming into the platforms, it becomes more beneficial for me to post my room or my hotel on the platform. That's a two-sided network effect. So network effects are really, really basic in the economical model of digital platforms and digital economy. Why is it problematic? It's problematic because it means that the bigger you are and the more dominant you are, you become better and you become more efficient. So it's like a snowball. When you get into an essential size, you attract everyone into your network, and then you become even better, and then you attract more people into your network, and then you become even better and you attract more people. So this is a growing phenomenon. What we find in digital platforms and in digital economy is that we have a tiny company that once it hits a critical mass, it suddenly becomes huge. And it suddenly becomes dominant. So in a blink of an eye, competition agencies find themselves confronting huge monopolies that turned out to be really huge very quickly. If you think, those of you who know how Tel Aviv looks, and I apologize for the guests from abroad, Tel Aviv is all covered with motorcycles of Wolt. Wolt, which is really a food delivery network, was not existing a few years ago. And now it conquers the whole of Tel Aviv. Why is it? Because once it reaches a critical mass, all the restaurants want to work with Wolt. And once all the restaurants want to work with Wolt, then I would like to have Wolt's application and order food through Wolt because they are the biggest, the quickest, they have the biggest variety of restaurants. So Wolt, for example, was very small a few years ago, and suddenly the competition authority in Israel finds themselves facing a big monopoly and a substantial monopoly. So this is also a huge challenge that we face when we deal with big tech. And the last thing that I will mention, which is also very critical, is the issue that many services are given for free. Not all of them, that's not the case always, but in many cases we consume the products of the digital platforms for free. And this is for competition economics, this is a huge challenge because we usually measure things by price. That's what the economists learn. They learn to measure things through the prices. They measure prices. That's a measurable thing. So for sure, everyone knows that competition is not only over price. There is competition over quality. There is competition over innovation. And economists recognize it. But how do you measure quality? How do you measure innovation? So at the end of the day, when we look at it, what economists do is usually measure the costs of things. And in fact, when I had to review mergers, the questions that we usually ask ourselves is whether as an outcome of the merger, the prices will rise. We knew that that also the services can be, service can decline and the innovation can decline, but we didn't know how to measure. So we always asked ourselves whether the customer will see a raise in the price. But when you talk about free products, then you can't measure it. And this is in fact a huge challenge for economists dealing with big tech platforms. And I don't believe that they started to solve this issue. So this was a long explanation and a very detailed explanation. Why is it that it is so difficult to deal with the digital platforms and to know how to regulate them properly? And that is not to say that I think that they shouldn't be regulated. In fact, I think that they should be regulated. And I'll discuss it in a few minutes. But it's very challenging, and I don't think that from economic analyses we are anywhere near where we should have been by now. Let's talk a little bit about where things are standing when we talk about digital platforms. Where are the enforcers standing? So until a few years ago, there was a huge amount of discussion between competition agencies and academia and scholars on what to do with digital market. We would go to every conference and we would hear the same discussions on digital market, and this was a prominent subject, but very little was in fact done. There was a lot of talk. There was growing understanding that this is something that we should address, but still very little was done. The first one that jumped into the water was the European Commission. In 2010, the European Commission started its first investigation against Google. And today they have 3 cases against Google. I will talk shortly about each one of them, but I want to emphasize today the European Commission has many other cases against digital platforms. They have cases against Apple and against Amazon. They have investigations all over in many cases, but I want really to have a deeper look at the 3 big cases that they had against Google. Mainly to show you how long it takes to create such a case. So they started their first shopping case. Google Shopping is a case where they accused Google for giving preference to their own products in their search engine and to their own platforms in the search engine. That was the main issue in the shopping case. The investigation started in 2010. They reached the imposition of sanctions in 2017. In 2021, the Court of First Instance upheld their decision. So it's 11 years after the investigation started, the court approved the decision of the European Commission. And by the way, it's still pending because Google, of course, appealed. So it's not the end of it. Meanwhile, they started two other investigations. One was an Android case, which is really a tying case, because what Google was accused of is that when it gave license to cell manufacturers to install Android, like Samsung, to install Android in the cell phone, they insisted that the Google applications will be the default on the cell phone, so that the cell phone will come as a default with Gmail, with Google Maps, and with YouTube, and all the other applications that Google owns. So it was a time, that was a condition. You want Android? Please install all our Google application as a default for the customer. So for this, they were sanctioned the unprecedented sanction of 4.3 billion euros. That's, at least as of today, the biggest sanction that was imposed by the European Commission. And there's a third case that started in 2015 and was in fact imposed a sanction in 2019. These two cases are still pending in court. Of course, Google appealed these two cases. Google settled on interim remedies on the tying case, on the Android case, but they did appeal the two other cases, and the cases are still pending. So today, we are standing in a situation where Google paid to the European Commission approximately 8.4 billion euros. And we have to admit that nothing really improved from competition perspective. So they were enforced fiercely, they paid huge amount of money, but we don't really see that Google became any weaker or any or less dominant in the market, and we don't see real improvement in the ways that Google in the dominance of Google in the market. So that makes us think a little bit about how effective all these enforcement steps are. Okay, I'll get back to it. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the US, at the same time that the shopping case was going on, the investigation on the shopping case, whether Google really prefers its own websites in the search engine, the FTC the FTC is a Federal Trade Commission. It's one of the two antitrust agencies in the US. They started the same investigation and they closed it because they found that there are no evidence for such preference. So the same investigation was opened on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and was closed, was shut down for no evidence of any preference. And in fact, until a few years ago, the Americans were very suspicious about all these enforcement proceedings that were initiated by the European Commission against Google and against other big tech companies. First of all, the Americans thought that this is technological industries that we shouldn't interfere with because we don't understand them sufficiently. Also, I heard the opinion that technological industries are always under a lot of competitive pressure. They need to continue being innovate and being at the forefront of everything, because otherwise they'll become obsolete in a minute, and the examples are many, and that's why they didn't want to interfere. And last, we have to say that in fact the Americans thought that all the enforcement proceedings that are taken by the European Commission are somewhat political. They thought that the big tech is American industrial champions, and that the Europeans find it easy to attack the US industries instead of dealing with their own European issues. So they were very suspicious about all these initiatives to start enforcing antitrust on technological platforms. And they didn't do much about it. All this started to change in 2019. In 2019, there were primaries to the Democratic Party in the US towards the election of 2020. And in these primaries, the issue of big tech came very prominently. Senator Warren put it as a main issue in her agenda, and Senator Klobuchar put it as a main issue in her agenda. And this rose a lot of awareness to the topic. And suddenly we saw in 2019 that that the two antitrust agencies in the US, the FTC and the DOJ, both of them started to engage in the issue of big tech. So the FTC established a team that was specialized on the issues of competition of big tech, and the DOJ started to getting involved in the issues. And by the end of 2020, we had two huge enforcement proceedings against big tech in the US. The first one was brought by the DOJ. The DOJ is a Department of Justice in the US that brought proceeding against Google, a big proceeding of violating its monopoly power by paying Apple to be the sole search engine in its cell phones. So this was a first enforcement initiative by the DOJ, and the FTC went and asked for their split of Facebook from Instagram and WhatsApp. So the FTC wanted to go back and resolve the mergers of Facebook with WhatsApp and Facebook with Instagram. These two cases went to court and they're still pending, so we have no resolution in them yet. But it shows a huge change in the attitude of the US towards big tech. It showed a shift towards the need to restrain big tech and to enforce competition regulation on them. So this is a very big change. Today, both, I want to make a footnote here. I'm talking a lot about Europe and the US because they are the most leading agencies on these topics, but we have to remember there are other agencies that are very active in this topic. The UK agency is very active and very successful. The Australians are doing a lot. Many of the European countries, Germany, France, are doing a lot of activity towards regulating big tech. So to simplify things, I'm talking only about the US and Europe, but there is a lot of action going on around big tech with other countries and other agencies too. So back to our theme, today both Europe and the US are in kind of a crossroad. Europe, after more than 10 years of enforcement, I think they understand that they achieve very little from their enforcement activity. They collected a lot of money, they collected from Google and from other companies, but they didn't really achieve a real improvement in the competition, and they really didn't change the market. And that's why the Europeans are heading towards deep regulation of big tech. And they are in the last stages of legislating two very big chunks of legislation. One is the Digital Market Act, and one is the Digital Service Act. You may have heard of these acts. They are two huge European legislation that will regulate big tech and will put a lot of limitation and a lot of restraints on their activities. So we're standing before a very big change that we'll see what will happen with. On the other hand, in the US, President Biden nominated two very proactive heads of agencies, both to head the DOJ and to head the FTC. You may have heard about Lina Khan, the head of the new head of the FTC, and Jonathan Kanter, the new head of the DOJ. They said very clearly that they want to be proactive about big tech. They want to enforce competition on big tech, and they want to deal with competition. But the situation in the US is very complex, because in the US, it's not the agencies that decide what happens with big tech, it's the courts. The courts have a lot of power on deciding the direction where antitrust law will go, because everything gets to court and they get to decide. And the courts in the US it's not a secret, are extremely conservative and reluctant to interfere with the market. And currently, both the FTC and the DOJ are losing case after case in courts. They're bringing cases to courts and they lose the cases. They are unable to convince court to be more intervening and more proactive. So what happens in this situation is that you go and try to legislate new laws. So that's also a way to address the issues. And there are in fact a lot of bills that were put on the table of Congress to enact dealing with big tech. But as we all know, the Congress in the US currently is only semi-functional. There are only very few issues in which there can be bipartisan in the US Congress and where consensus can be achieved. So we all know it's very difficult to legislate today new laws in the US because the Congress is polarized and it's very difficult to achieve consensus there. So that's why the American, we don't know where the American system is heading yet. We have proactive agencies, we have conservative court system, and we have legislator that is polarized and is not being able to reach consensus on these topics. So that's the current issue in the US. Now let's, before I head it to you for your questions or for your discussion, I want to talk a little bit about what I think should be the right direction to deal with. So when we talk about what should be the right direction, we should split it to the question to two. First question is who is the relevant regulator that should be responsible to regulate big tech? And the other question is what is the good regulation, or what will be the smart regulation to deal with? So the question on who should deal with this situation relies very much on the question whether you think the basic problem is a competition problem. Because if you believe that through antitrust law or an expanded version of antitrust law, you can deal with big tech, then it will be wise to put the competition agencies and the antitrust agencies in charge. If you think that the problem is beyond antitrust and competition, then you need to have a specific regulator that will be able to regulate this big tech properly. In fact, my answer to this is we need both. We need really to expand antitrust rules in order to deal with big tech, and at the same time, we need a different regulation that antitrust agencies will not be the one responsible for. And I'll explain a little bit my thought about it. In the last decade, there were approximately 400 acquisitions that were done by Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. And that's not companies that they developed, that's companies that they acquired, and there are many others that they acquired. And antitrust agencies and competition agencies didn't challenge any one of these transactions. None of them was challenged. And antitrust agencies just let all these mergers go by and approved them, and did not block any one of the 400 mergers or more than 400 mergers that these companies did in the last decade. And today, we know that there is a problem of what we call killer acquisition. It was proved, it was empirically proved that in the technological industries, big technologies, big tech, big companies acquire new startups in order to kill them, or in order to avoid competition, in order to stop the development of the new technologies that would challenge them. It was proved empirically in the pharmaceutical industry, and in fact, the FTC case against Facebook is exactly this case. They discovered, in hindsight, many years after it happened, but they discovered that the real reason why Facebook wanted to acquire Instagram and the real reason why Facebook wanted to acquire WhatsApp was because they were concerned that these platforms will become competitors, valid competitors to them, and they wanted to avoid this competition. So the phenomena exist, but we don't know how to deal with it. Even now that we understand that it exists, competition agencies are not equipped enough to be able to stop or block such mergers. They don't know how to recognize these mergers, and they don't have sufficient evidence to deal with them. So that's an area where competition agencies should develop themselves. They should also deal with phenomena that they're not used to deal with, and this is that the big tech use their huge amount of data that they have about us in order to acquire or to expand to more and more new markets. Usually, the traditional antitrust laws do not condemn companies that develop themselves and expand themselves to new markets. There is nothing wrong with it. But when we talk about big tech and we see how they use the huge amount of data to expand to themselves to more and more markets, and they become dominant in each market that they expand themselves, then this is something that we should start to address. And the competition agencies are not equipped to address it. Another thing that should really develop in antitrust and competition when dealing with big tech is cooperation between agencies. Big tech is global. All countries face exactly the same problem, and they face it exactly against the same companies. When I was the head of the competition authority in Israel, we started a case against Facebook. So we needed to collect data to prove what market they're active in, the social network market. We needed to prove that such market exists, and we needed to prove that they're dominant in this market, so we needed to prove their market share. And I felt very ridiculous that we're doing this exercise. We invested a huge amount of resources in defining the right market and measuring the market share of Facebook. But this was done by several other agencies in the past, in proceedings that they had with Facebook. And social network is social network is social network wherever you go. So why is it, to my opinion, ridiculous that competition agencies work in a separate way and do not challenge the issues together and do not attack the same problems or address the same problems in a coordinated manner? There are today, even today as we speak, some pending issues that we know that they disturb many agencies. So for example, the fact that we have two companies that control the app stores that we all hold, Google and Apple, and they hold the door for all application developers. This is the things that bothers the Australians, the UK, the Europeans, the Americans. They're all concerned with this issue. Why not deal with this issue together? This is something that needs to be changed in competition and antitrust, and we need to look at it from a global perspective. This requires that the agencies will be able to share evidence among themselves. So this is also something that should be achieved and soon. That's on the antitrust perspective. But I will say that I think that not all is antitrust. I think there is a bigger issue, even beyond antitrust, beyond privacy, beyond consumer protection. And that is the concern of the size of the companies. So from antitrust perspective, we usually do not condemn companies for being big. But as economists, we must recognize that there is this size that starts to be concerning. There is a valid concern that companies are becoming too big and too powerful for the economy to hold. As democracy want to decentralize power, so does economy. Good economy wants to be decentralized. So there's a real concern when companies become too big and too powerful for the economy to control. And I think this is something that economies should address not through antitrust and not through competition, and they should put on the table all the possible remedies and discuss in a thorough way all the possible remedies that are possible in order to reduce the size of these companies and reduce their power. And it might require very aggressive measures like divestitures and splitting some companies and not allowing them to enter to new areas. That's not antitrust, that's not competition, but it must be thoroughly addressed and thoroughly considered today, because we're facing a really huge problem with the fact that they're so big and so powerful. Okay, I'll leave it here because I spoke now for almost an hour and I want to leave time for you for question and for discussion. So I turn it to you and go ahead, your turn.
Actually, I have a question about the zero price markets. I mean, in most social media, it is the case, but like usually there's a saying, if the product is free, it means you are the product. So like, is it like important in the debate, like to have like the discussion about the price? Because like I think that in social media, the subject is not the price, but it's about the data protection and the protection of personal life and personal opinion.
Yeah.
Personal information.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a very good point, and I agree. I agree that there are no free lunches. No products are given really for free to us. So when we get something for free, we understand today, we didn't understand it several years ago, but today we do understand that we provide a lot of data for these platforms, and these data serves them in their business model. Now they can monetize it to advertising, and they can monetize it to enter to new markets. So we do not pay through money, but we pay with our data. But I have to tell you, economists are not knowledgeable enough to measure this issue. They do not still treat data as a currency. And it's very difficult for them to be able to measure whether when you talk about raising price, it's difficult for them to talk about raise in the data that is collected. So I agree with your observation that this is an issue and that it should be addressed, but I think today economists do not have the tools to deal with it.
Two questions. The first one, you said that you think that the struggle is the same struggle for every antitrust agency. So do you think like an international body should be formed to make like a international standard to face big tech, because it really is borderless when you talk about Facebook and Google and all the big tech? And the second question, do you think that a good tool to address the monopolies will be maybe price controls? Because it is known that if you have a monopoly in a market and you don't have a way to open the market, price control may be like a solution.
Okay, so I'll answer the two questions. My dream is that there will be one global competition regulator dealing with big tech. So the short answer to your question is yes, that would be perfect. Realistically, today it's not achievable. We have to understand that below the surface, or even not so much below the surface, there's a lot of industrial policy issues here. The Americans do not treat the big tech industry as the Europeans treat them. The Americans see the big tech as their champions. They're the head of their industry. That's where their advantages is. And in fact, when the big tech comes into Washington, D.C. and explain that they need to have advantage in order to be able to fight the Chinese technology, it rings a bell with the ears of the politicians in D.C. because the Americans are also fighting the Chinese front on the technological side that the Europeans are not. So there's a lot of industrial policy concerns on the surface and below the surface that I think will not make one global competition regulator for big tech a feasible matter. But if you ask me what is the best way forward, yeah, it will be the best way forward. I will only give, today, technological companies, when they merge, so for example, when one of these mergers take place, the companies need to file merger control filing in a few dozens of different countries. If you would have one global competition agency dealing with all the issues of technology, it will review the merger only once. It will take into account all the countries, but it will review the merger only once for the whole globus. So this will be perfect. I don't think it's achievable today. As to price control, as I said, in many cases, not always, not all the platforms, in many cases, the products or the services are given for free. We use, I don't know how much you used your WhatsApp or your Messenger throughout my presentation today in the last hour, but you used it for free. They didn't charge you anything, so I don't see how price control or price supervision can assist here, and that's even without talking about the great defaults in having price supervision. It's not a good measure in my opinion. Excuse me?
Hey, my question is, in the last quarter we saw, did you start to speak or something?
No,
Okay.
go ahead.
In the last quarter we saw a decrease in the number of users of Facebook and the number of users of Netflix. And my question is, don't we fight the war of yesterday? Because the competition is rising from time to time, and the big techs fighting on us, on the users.
Well, I wish I could share the feeling that it's the fights of yesterday. I think what we're seeing more and more is that the big techs are competing among themselves. So if you would ask the Google management or the Apple management, do they feel that they have a lot of competition? They will tell you yes, and they will be right for saying yes, because the big techs are competing with each other. And they're competing to be at the front and not fall back and not become redundant or obsolete. So they have a lot of competitive pressure on them. But it's what we see more and more is that they're competing between themselves. So Google will compete with Apple, and Google will compete with Facebook. But we don't see new entries of we see very little new entries of new big technologies. And we know that it's more and more difficult to be a startup today that will be able to succeed on its own legs without being acquired by one of the big techs. So I don't think it's a fight of yesterday. Excuse me?
It goes like that, so eventually it will go there. Hi. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but I think it will be unfair, so I'll just pick one. The first one is more of an observation than a question.
Go ahead.
I think that Sabah said it yesterday, and our Bahraini friends also said it. And I think all of you that live in a monarchy, it's good, you know? So when the Western civilization comes in and says, why don't you like democracy? It's like, it's the best thing we ever invented. And Sabah said, we don't want it. We'll live fine. We live in paradise. That's his words. What I'm trying to say is that the difficulties of competition authorities regarding big tech, maybe it has a reason, because those companies does what they does best. And maybe they are the pioneers of their markets, you know, Microsoft and Apple. They took the risk. Steve Jobs failed tons of times before he invented the Macintosh, and Bill Gates as well. So these guys invented what we called today as basic technology. I think that maybe the change will be from the bottom up and not from the top down, since these technologies rely on us, on the users. And we could see it without any political review or anything, just an observation. We saw it on Twitter, and that President Trump got blocked and sent away from the platform, so he opened another one. And people followed, maybe a few, but people followed because they had enough of the censorship and the influence that Twitter has on their opinion. And today we also see on COVID that Facebook has to make a notice that this post has an information about COVID, and you should be aware of it. So I think the solution might be from the bottom and not necessarily from regulation, but maybe from education. So this is the observation. Now the question. Sorry, it's taking too long. Um, so you mentioned Walt. Walt came into an existing market. Well, food services existed in Israel and delivery existed. We had 10-base and we had independent delivery guys. Everything that Walt did just make it better and more efficient. And I think they're doing a great job, but now they're kind of a monopoly. They're taking way too much money on their delivery. So how do you suggest that? I think maybe I'll try to phrase it very good. How do you know that the competition is the problem? So maybe it's just good to have one big, strong company that does what it does best. I think this is the question.
Okay, so the question is a very good one, because that's exactly the problem with network effects. It's the best to have only one. Everyone participating in the same network is very efficient. If you have only one telephone network, then that's the most efficient way. It's called natural monopoly. So in network effects, you in many cases have a natural monopoly. And it's good to have only one network that everyone will participate in. It brings a lot of efficiencies. The problem is that monopoly is monopoly. So when you become monopoly, you start charging a lot of money, and we know that Walt is charging a lot of money, especially from restaurants. You start to reduce the level of service. You don't have enough incentive to innovate. And these are all effects that are very, are not good. And that's what the faults of monopolies. So the huge challenge of competition agencies and antitrust agencies is to balance the great efficiencies with the potential harm of monopolies. And that's why it's so challenging. That's one of the points that I made. That's why it's a challenge.
Aren't you worried that limiting those companies will just make corporations like Tencent rule over the market, like Chinese companies merging with every other company instead of those companies?
I'm not sure I followed. Can you ask again?
Yeah, so in China there are like big corporations like Google, Facebook that owns a lot of companies inside of them. And they can buy companies from the US too. There's no limitations. So if we limit those United States companies and European companies, aren't you just worried that the unregulated Tencent or other corporations in China are going to take over the market?
Yeah, so that goes back to industrial policy concerns. And in fact, they are valid concerns. They are not competition concerns, because, you know, I'm indifferent to from competition perspective, and the question whether the companies that will prevail will be Chinese or American. But I can understand why the Americans are not indifferent to this question. So there are a lot of industrial policies, industrial policy considerations that needs to be considered, and I think that it's fine for the US to think about it and to put it on the table and to take it into consideration. But it's not a competition issue by itself. So if you clean up and look at it only from antitrust and competition perspectives, this is something that I wouldn't consider. If you ask me on the big regulation of big tech, if this should be considered, yes. This is something that should be on the table and should be thought of when we think about the proper regulation.
Just a quick comment to what Tzur said earlier. I'm not sure that the food delivery market is a market that has to have a natural monopoly, like Michal said. I think competition would do great things for this market, personally. And I wanted to ask you about Walt. You talked about B2C and B2B antitrust and competition related issues. And I wanted to ask you about labor laws and gig economy work arrangements. What are your thoughts? Because I know that our current labor law legislation is just not providing the right solutions for this area of thought. So just wanted to ask you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to say I'm not an expert on labor law. But I do think that when we talk about regulating big tech, and I was talking about the different disciplines, privacy, consumer protection, cyber, and many issues that rise up, I didn't put labor law, but in fact, you're absolutely right. The phenomenon of gig economy is a phenomenon that should be addressed. I am not sure that the Israeli labor law is not fit to address it. We might not like what the Israeli labor law says about it, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the right answers. Labor law is different very much. I love the discipline because I think it's very challenging, but labor law comes from a very protective discipline where you think that where the basic belief is that workers cannot think of their own good interest, and the state needs to interfere in order to protect them more than they think that they should protect themselves. That's the basic notion of labor law, and this is a clash with the gig economy. It clashes with the big gig economy. It doesn't mean that the state is wrong about it and how it regulates labor law, but there is a confrontation, and I absolutely agree with you that this is one of the issues that needs to be addressed coming into big tech. Not only Wolt, also Uber and other gig economy platforms are also needs to be addressed. Yeah.
So I was thinking about what you said before with the EU Commission with the lawsuit about don't remember the exact name, but with Samsung that they used all the
Android case, yeah. The
yeah,
Android case.
So at the end of the day, I may be simplifying this a bit, but Samsung, it was in their best interest to get Android and the Google apps, and it was in the best interest of Google to put these apps, and they signed a contract, which is completely legal, and we do want to keep the freedom of doing contracts. And we also talked about the fact that it's very hard for new startups and new companies to enter the market. So then I think about all this regulation that is going to come in, and I don't disagree that it needs to be regulated, but I'm asking if is there any thought to balance it out with helping younger companies to enter the market or doing something about that? Because I think, okay, if we're going to limit the ability to do contracts and we're going to put in so much more regulation, which I'm sure that these big companies will somehow find a way to still function with, aren't we just, in a way, making it more difficult for everyone to complete their interests or to get their goals?
Yeah, so I'll start with referring to the first part of what you said about the Android case. For sure, the deal between Samsung and Google was good both for Samsung that wanted the Android and was willing to put the great platforms on Google, and it was good for Google, that's for sure. But was it good for the consumer? Was it good for competition? Was it good for innovation of new platforms? I think not. So in many cases, what's good for the parties that are doing the deal is not exactly what's good for the consumer and what's good for competition. And that's the whole essence of antitrust, because when you look at a cartel arrangement, for example, it's very good for the parties to do such an agreement, but it doesn't mean that it's lawful, and it doesn't mean that they're allowed to do it. And what the European Commission said was that, no, it's not allowed, because you're both great with agreement, but the agreement harms competition and harms innovation and harms the consumers that get all these Google applications that they might want, but they might just as well not want. So for example, I do not use in my cell phone the Chrome application. I use DuckDuckGo, but I didn't get it as a default on my cell phone. I got Chrome as a default. So the fact that you are not allowing the consumer to choose their own application, and the fact that you're putting as a default the Google application, it affects the consumer, and in fact it affects the motivation to innovate new applications. So I think it was a good enforcement step by the European Commission, and a justified one. That's what I believe. You're absolutely right that if we put regulation on big tech, it will have effect on the speed of innovation. It will have effect maybe even on the ability of consumer to get the most from technology. That may very well be the case if we will get aggressive regulation at the end of the day. And in Europe, we're absolutely heading in this direction. But always the question is, what will you achieve in the long run? Because in the short run, it might make things slower and less attractive for the consumer. But you might achieve a lot in the long run.
First, thank you for the lecture. I think it's a subject I am very concerned about. We talked about Europe, that they really also concerned and care about competition in the tech industry. But I think US, it's for us, it's the biggest country. It has a lot of influence about all of our lives. What do you think is going to happen there? If the court doesn't really have some effect, and I think the people don't really pressure the government to do something. So, what do you think is going to be next in the US about it?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right, that we all expected that US will lead the world in how to regulate big tech. US owns big tech. I mean, they're mostly Americans, the big tech companies, so they own them. They are in a better position to impose regulation on them because they sit in the US. It's much more difficult for other countries. And I think it's the role of the US to lead the whole world on what would be the proper regulation. And I will even say that I think that the economic development, the economic research in the US is more developed than in any other country around the world. They invented the economic research and they're doing it very well. So they have the best tool to regulate it properly. The thing is that they're stuck. They're stuck in a polarized system, and that's why they're in a standstill situation. They do not go in any direction. So there's kind of a vacuum there. And into this vacuum comes in the European Commission, the UK agency, the Korean agencies, the Australian agency, the Japanese agency, different European agencies, and so they starting to regulate. Now, if you'll ask me, I don't like all the regulation that they're doing. There are some things that they're doing that I think are not that perfect and are not that good. But at least they're doing something. They're starting to do their first steps. I think they will discover that some of the steps that they're doing are not good, and they'll need to correct themselves and to calibrate themselves to a proper regulation. But they're doing the first step in regulating. So there's a vacuum that the Americans left, and the Europeans are are drawn into this vacuum, and they're doing the regulation. So today they're dominating the way that the regulation of this industry will go.
Hey, when I think about a competitive market, I think that anyone can sell anything and can buy anything. So if I have a startup, which we all agree it's a very competitive place and area, so I have a startup and Google want to buy me. If they will pay me very good and I make money and them make money, why to interrupt? So I really think about that. Okay, if I don't want to sell them, I will manage myself, and someday I will competitive with Facebook and all. If not. Why to interrupt with a regulation?
Well, that goes back to why do we need antitrust at all, and why do we need merger review? So I'm sure it's not a question only about technological industries. It's a question that you would ask about telecommunication, for example. If I'm a cell phone company, and why wouldn't you allow me to sell myself and my operation to my competitor? Why avoid it? Why not allow one cell phone buy all of its competitors? Why block such mergers? So the same goes exactly for big tech. If you're a startup and you have a startup that can challenge Google, assuming you have this invention that potentially can challenge Google in one of their activities, then I think we should consider thoroughly whether we should allow Google to acquire you. WhatsApp and Instagram were bought by Facebook for a lot of money. I am sure they were very happy with the exit that they made. But are the consumer happy? The antitrust agencies are responsible to protect the consumers, not the freedom of parties to do exits. And they didn't know at the time that they're harming consumers, but today we do know that WhatsApp and Instagram had a potential of creating networks that will compete with Facebook.
You talked about regulation regarding competition and innovation, and I want to know if there is any regulation from an ethical standpoint. What scares me mostly is companies like Meta, that Mark Zuckerberg wants me to live in an imaginary world, and I don't know if we can stop him without regulation, but it doesn't seem to be in your conversation, or so I want to know.
Yeah, I agree with this criticism. I did not talk about this aspect, but that is not to say that your concern is not a correct concern. I agree with you. It is a huge concern. And I think, but I have to admit that competition agencies have no expertise in how to deal with the huge ethical problems coming from big tech. And there are ethical problems that needs to be addressed. And that's why I think that we cannot put all our pressure on antitrust and competition agencies. And the thought that if only we had good competition agencies that they will resolve all the pending issues, I think it's a wrong thought. I think governments should sit down and think thoroughly about ethical problems, about problems on the decentralization of economic power, about problem of how much, what part of the economy do the big tech hold today, and start coming up with solutions that they are able to impose on the big tech and on the economy to start regulating these issues.